Chapter 1201. Lucy got his contact and added the number. She then turned to look at Naomi and smiled. "Do you want me to share the contact with you?" Naomi choked. "No. No thanks. It's okay. No need to pretend. How will you move forward if you are too shy? Aren't you single? Here's your chance." Lucy laughed. Naomi immediately looked away. "What do you mean by chance?" "To seduce him." After Lucy said that, she suddenly remembered something and curiously looked at Naomi. "Have you been in a relationship before?" Naomi was called out and couldn't find her words. Lucy tapped her shoulder. "It's fine that you haven't been in a relationship before. I won't laugh at you, don't worry." Lucy then opened up her contacts. "Are you on WhatsApp?" Naomi pressed her lips together while she slowed her footsteps. After a moment, she said, "I don't have WhatsApp." Lucy turned to look at her, both surprised and curious. At the Bouchers, Eugene sat on the couch reading a magazine. When he saw his son coming home, he put down the magazine. "You've been visiting your mother lately." Francisco nodded, stopped in front of the stairs, and loosened his tie. "Mom has been well. You don't need to worry about her." Eugene was going to say something, but didn't and changed the subject. "Attend the Hannigans and Santiago's marriage with me tomorrow." "Okay." Francisco went upstairs. As the night got darker, the lights lit up. The wedding of Tanner and Pearl was held at a 5-star hotel owned by the Hannigan. Everyone in Bassburg knew about the wedding, but they didn't know why it had been delayed for a year. Someone speculated that Tanner didn't want to go on with it, not wanting to marry a tainted woman, but his father had made him do it since he didn't want to let the Santiagos slip away. Of course, there was speculation that it was the Santiagos wanting to call it off too. No one knew what actually happened. Around a dozen luxury cars drove into the valet area. Those attending were close relatives, friends, and business partners of both families. The Santiagos knew many people in the jewelry industry because of the La Perla group, and La Perla was just second to Taylor's. Antonio and Mrs. Santiago greeted their relatives and guests in the banquet hall. Nathaniel and his wife were smiling widely, and Antonio seemed to be smiling too. Only Mrs. Santiago didn't look happy. Sometimes Antonio would remind her, and she would smile awkwardly. Eugene arrived with Francisco, and Nathaniel walked over smiling and said, "Thank you for coming. This is such a pleasure. Let's put the past behind us." Since Nathaniel walked over first and there were a lot of guests around, Eugene took up the glass on the table. "The past is in the past. It's a happy day for Mr. Hannigan and Miss Santiago, so I'm going to toast to that." They both took a drink, then Nathaniel walked them to their seats. Since the groom's side had invited them, they stayed on that side. After Francisco sat down, he looked up at a woman checking her phone. "It's her." Naomi sat next to Anthony, but unlike the other socialites, she dressed more casually. She was in a denim jacket and a white turtleneck top with her hair neatly tied up in a bun, showing off her beautiful face. Chapter 1202. Naomi had a classic oval shape that's the size of a hand, delicate and small. She didn't fit in the rowdy crowd, and so she stood out. After all the guests arrived, the ceremony started. The MC did an opening monologue, and the lights dimmed. Then the wedding march began, and everyone looked toward the bride, who slowly walked in. Pearl had a veil on, and her dress had a long train. She took one step at a time while holding on to her father's arm. Tanner stood on stage, and his expression was unclear due to the dim lights. Antonio handed his daughter to Tanner. He took her hand, and they turned and walked toward the MC. The MC congratulated them and asked if he promised to take her as his wife from this day forward until death separated them. Suddenly, a voice came from the crowd. "He doesn't want to." Everyone looked toward the woman with short hair among the crowd. She was also in a white wedding dress, and everyone started talking. Nathaniel's face dropped, and he immediately asked some security guards to come over. The woman walked toward the stage while everyone watched. Tanner raised his eyebrows. Have you gone mad? I know your dad is making you marry her. You don't even love her. The woman pressed her palm to her heart, her eyes turning red. You said you wouldn't marry her. Sandy, go home, Tanner calmly said. The guards rushed over and escorted her away. She didn't want to leave, so she struggled. I won't leave. The guard gave her a tug which made her lose her footing and fall to the floor. At that moment, she yelled out loud, I'm pregnant. The guards immediately took a step back, and everyone, including the Hannigan, was in shock. The Santiagos looked horrified. Heavens! How could this happen? Mr. Hannigan is just treating this marriage as a game. How could he marry Miss Santiago after getting someone else pregnant? Such a shame to the family. The guests started chattering, and Nathaniel couldn't stand it anymore. He yelled at the guards, take her away immediately. The guards grabbed her, but she fell to the floor again. Tanner rushed toward her, pushed the guards away, and helped her up. Are you all right, Sandy? Sandy DuPont hugged him in tears. Tan, I'm pregnant. I don't know what to do. If you married her, our child would be a bastard. Tanner stood there on the spot. His body froze while she hugged him. Antonio slammed the table and stood up. After all this hassle, you have a kid now? So, is my daughter the other woman? Mrs. Santiago complained to him. I told you I didn't want them to get married. You wouldn't listen. She knew that Tanner wasn't sincere in marrying their daughter. She would not let her daughter be put in shame even if no one wanted to marry her. Tanner stood there with his lips pressed while the crowd murmured along. He turned toward Pearl, standing in the shadows in a white, spotless wedding dress, her makeup elegant. She was expressionless and didn't say anything. She wasn't just some person in the crowd, but she seemed numb to all that. Sandy held her belly. Tan, my stomach is hurting. Would you leave with me? Tanner was brought back into reality with that question. He clenched his jaw and carried her in his arms. You better not leave with her. Nathaniel yelled at him. You need to remember who you are. Chapter 1203. Tanner took a deep breath, paused, but left with Sandy in his arms without looking back. Tanner Hannigan. Nathaniel yelled without a shred of control. A sharp pain shot up his heart, and he grabbed his chest. Suddenly blood came out of his mouth. Mrs. Hannigan's face turned pale while she grabbed her husband. My love. The groom left with another woman and left the bride standing on stage alone during their wedding. Everyone felt sorry for her. Antonio had to stand up and control the situation, but some guests still left without having their dinner, and Eugene Boucher was one of them. He got to the doorway and noticed that Francisco wasn't behind him. Let's go. There's nothing to see. You asked me to come, but now you're asking me to leave too. You can leave first if you want to. Francisco turned around. Eugene didn't say what he wanted to and just left. Pearl walked down from the stage and took off her veil. Mrs. Santiago kept complaining about Antonio's decision, which had put both them and the Hannigan in an awkward situation. Antonio just sat there, not saying anything back. Pearl walked out with her train in hand and into the room at the back. Naomi followed her. Miss Santiago. Pearl, who was taking off her earrings, paused and turned to look at Naomi. She knew that she was the daughter of Anthony Topaz. If you came to console me, don't. Naomi looked down. You had an agreement, so you had the right to ask him to stay. Why did you just watch while your soon-to-be husband left with another woman? Naomi had noticed that Tanner might not really want to leave with that woman. If she had said something, things might have ended differently. Pearl laughed while she removed her makeup. It was a marriage that we had to beg for. To begin with, it wasn't mine, so why should I put myself in a shameful position and beg him to stay? A marriage that you had to beg for? Naomi didn't understand. Pearl got up and walked toward her, smirking. No one in Bassburg would want to marry a woman who had lost her reputation like me. My dad was more than happy that Tanner was willing to marry me. A dirty woman like me can't expect a good man to ignore my past. Naomi paused and looked at Pearl. You shouldn't think of yourself that way. I'm sorry because I don't know what happened to you, so I can't judge. All I wanted to say was that you shouldn't care what people think of you. Everyone should have a chance at happiness, and that includes you. Happiness? Pearl smirked. You're a well-protected woman and haven't gone through any hardship, or you wouldn't have said any of that. You can look forward to happiness, but I can't. That's reality. Pearl walked aside and removed her wedding dress. Everyone should pay for what they did. And this is my punishment. Naomi left the room and didn't understand what Pearl meant by that. She suddenly saw Francisco speaking to a few older gentlemen at the corner of the corridor. She was surprised that he was at the wedding. How did she not notice? Francisco stood at a higher spot wearing a black and blue coat with a turtleneck knitted sweater. It was simple, yet it looked great. After the men left, Francisco turned and saw Naomi standing not too far away. Her heart skipped a beat, but she still greeted him. Mr. Boucher, you're here. Chapter 1204. Francisco smiled. Did you just notice? Naomi suddenly became anxious, because she had never spoken to a man like this before, so she had no idea what to talk about. She wished that she was Lucy, because she was so brave. Naomi took a deep breath and tried to change the subject. Didn't you leave? No, I was just going to. Francisco looked at his watch. I'm going to go downstairs. Naomi opened her mouth, but didn't say anything, then nodded. All right. Aren't you going down as well? Oh, yes. Naomi wanted to pull her tongue out. She couldn't even speak normally anymore. She walked past Francisco and got in front. Francisco looked at her back. It was the first time he had met such a shy woman. That wasn't right. She had been pretty brave when she encountered that road bully. When they got into the elevator, there were a lot of people inside who were also going down. Naomi and Francisco stood on separate sides, and when the elevator moved down, the crowd going in and out slowly pushed her. The man who was standing next to her kept leaning in on her, and she could smell the stench of alcohol on him. She took a look at him and saw that it was a poorly dressed man. Naomi moved her feet, but the man's hand grazed her thigh. Francisco could tell that Naomi was uncomfortable, so he looked at the man standing next to him and could immediately tell what was wrong. He suddenly put out his arm, pulled Naomi over, and switched sides with her, so she stood in front of the buttons. Francisco then blocked her from the rest of the people. He looked back at the man who looked away sheepishly. Naomi lowered her head while they stood there, her heart pounding and the warmth of his hand still lingering on her wrist. When they got out, she slowly caught up. Thank you for that. Francisco looked at her. Don't worry about it. Naomi quickly looked away and smiled. I'm leaving then, bye. She waved to him, turned around, and left. She felt like she was escaping. The next day, at Seoul. Naomi looked tired when she arrived at the office because she hadn't slept well. She kept feeling that she had lost something the night before. When she remembered Lucy saying she wouldn't get a chance if she didn't make the first move, she would never get a chance. She must have been pretty silly in front of him. Naomi looked up. What's up? She smiled and walked in, then leaned over the table. Guess if the man who saved us said yes when I asked him out. Naomi's face froze a little. You asked him out? Yes. Lucy nodded. We're acquaintances now. There's no point keeping him in my contacts and not doing anything about it. After that she raised her eyebrows. Guess. Naomi looked down. He probably said yes? Yes. Lucy took out her phone. I said I would bring you along. Naomi was surprised. What? I've never used it before. Who doesn't have WhatsApp in this time and age? Let me help you. Lucy took her phone and helped her with it. Naomi took a deep breath while her heart thumped. Lucy, I think this should happen naturally. I don't think it's a good idea. Even if you don't get into a relationship, it's alright just to be friends. Lucy used her phone number to sign up and even set up a profile picture and username for her. I got you a beautiful picture, and the username is a girly one. Chapter 1205. Naomi put her palm to her forehead. She felt that she was being set up. Hashtag Mr. Tanner eloped with another woman. Hashtag. The wedding between the Hannigan and Santiagos started trending on Twitter, and many people were berating Tanner. Those who were berating him were mostly women because they were calling him out for running away with Sandy, who had made a scene at the wedding. Most of the men were on Tanner's side, saying it was better for him to run away than marry a woman who was tainted. When Antonio saw the news, he angrily threw the newspaper at the table. Tanner Hannigan is pure evil. Mrs. Santiago looked at him coldly. Are you happy now? Antonio quietly admitted that the Hannigan had toyed with them. He remembered something and suddenly looked at his wife. Did you know about this? Mrs. Santiago's expression was stoic. She had learned about it 1 year ago. They had been elated when the Hannigan were willing to accept their tainted daughter, so they just wanted them to give it a go. As long as Tanner didn't mind, they might be able to slowly fall for each other. At first, she had been happy with Tanner being their son-in-law because he looked really caring when he was with Pearl and took great care of her. She had even thought that he was a good person for Pearl to spend the rest of her life with. However, it was raining that day when she sent Pearl to their apartment. After Pearl went in, when Mrs. Santiago was going to drive away, another car slowly drove over and parked in front of her car. She recognized that that was Tanner's car and saw him walking down with an umbrella in hand. She was going to open the window and greet her son-in-law when he walked over to the passenger's side, and the woman who got out hugged him. Tanner put his arm on the girl's shoulders so she wouldn't get wet and kissed her after getting into the building. The scene made her tear up. She hated men who played around. She quietly followed them, and when they didn't get out of Pearl's floor, she found out that the woman was a tenant of the building too. After a few days of observation, she found all the evidence and was certain that Tanner was in a relationship with that woman called Sandy DuPont. Mrs. Santiago snapped out of it and said, "This marriage is over. Even if my daughter never gets married, even if all the men in the world died except Tanner, I won't let her go through this again." Antonio was stunned. At the hospital, Sandy rubbed her belly and happily talked about their future. She noticed that Tanner wasn't listening when she turned around, so her smile froze. "Tan?" "Yes?" He turned to look at her. "What is it? Are you not excited about our child?" Sandy was cautious with her question. Tanner didn't reply. Tears welled up in her eyes. "Did I put you in a tough spot? Are you regretting this?" He rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Not at all." "Then why didn't you reply?" Sandy pulled his hand. "Tan, are you regretting eloping? But you don't even love her. You were just forced to get married." "Sandy, there's a lot going on my mind right now. Please give me some space. I left my father because of you. What else do you want?" Tanner's impatience made Sandy let go, and she started sobbing. Tanner looked at her. She cried easily. He used to feel bad when she cried, but all he felt was annoyance after seeing it so many times. Chapter 1206. Tanner thought about Pearl. Even though she had seen everything he did with Sandy in the office, this woman had never once shed a single tear. He thought she might have an inferiority complex, because she considered herself filthy, and it was a gift to her that a man would marry her, but that was not the case. Did she have an inferiority complex? Not really. After all, she had never asked anything from him before. It was more appropriate to say that she was cold-blooded compared to having an inferiority complex. Aloof, apathetic, indifferent, she always had that expression on her face even after learning of his scandalous relationship with Sandy. It was like nothing could break her down. At that moment, Mrs. Hannigan called Tanner and said something to him. He rose to his feet and said, "I'll be right there." He took his jacket and went to the door. He had not slept for a whole night, and he was very tired right now. "Tan, are you leaving? Who are you going to see? Pearl?" Tanner's face turned grim when Sandy said that. He turned around to look at her. "I thought you were smarter than I thought you were." After that, he left without turning his head. Sandy was stunned. She sat on the bed and bit her lower lips tightly as she watched. Nathaniel had fallen unconscious because of a spike in high blood pressure and a cerebral hemorrhage. Mrs. Hannigan was crying in the ward. Her daughter was in prison, and her stepson didn't like her. Nathaniel was all she had left of the Hannigan. When she saw Tanner, she shouted at him, "Where have you been? He's your father. Are you not even concerned about his life?" Tanner did not say anything. The doctor came over and advised them to perform the surgery. If not, Nathaniel might be in great danger. When Mrs. Hannigan heard what the doctor said, she cried so much that she nearly fainted. "Is there no other way other than craniotomy?" Or nodded and continued sternly. "There's no other better option. Once the intracranial hemorrhage reaches 30 milliliters, we must perform the operation on the patient. This is because after the brain hemorrhage reaches a certain amount, it'll compress the nearby brain tissue, thus aggravating the condition in an acute and dangerous manner with a very high mortality rate." Mrs. Hannigan took a step forward and grabbed the doctor. "No, we can't perform the craniotomy on him. It's too dangerous. He's too old. Can you guys guarantee that he'll be safe?" "Mrs. Hannigan, every surgery has its own risk. Judging from the patient's current condition, he won't last a few days at all. If we perform the surgery on him, he'll have a better chance of surviving." "But let's do the surgery," Tanner chimed in, cutting Mrs. Hannigan short. Mrs. Hannigan's emotions got the best of her, and she shouted, "Have you gone mad, Tanner? Craniotomy is riskier than normal surgery. It's the head. If there is an accident. If you want to watch him die, go ahead. I won't stop you." Tanner interrupted, silencing Mrs. Hannigan. The doctor pushed his glasses and asked, "So, have you guys made up your mind?" "Yeah," Tanner replied. The doctor brought them a surgery consent form. He signed his name on it and confirmed the date of the surgery. His phone had been ringing throughout the entire process, but he did not pick it up. He only sat on the bench in the corridor and pulled his phone out after he had finished everything. The 18 missed calls were all from Sandy. He did not know why, but he did not have the intention of calling her back. In the end, he switched off the phone. It wasn't until the next day, when Nathaniel was pushed out of the operating room, that Tanner received a call from the nursery saying that Sandy tried to kill herself by cutting her wrists the previous day. He hastily headed over to the nursery. When Sandy woke up, the first thing she saw was Tanner. He crossed his fingers together and placed them on his forehead. He looked tired and depressed. She grinned weakly and said, "Tan, I knew you still love me." Hearing her voice, Tanner knew that she had woken up. He looked at her with a grim expression and said, "Sandy, you know what I hate the most? I hate being threatened." Chapter 1207. Sandy's smile froze and slowly disappeared. "Tan. I didn't mean it." She disregarded the pang that shot from the wound of her wrist and propped herself up from the bed to explain to Tanner, "I couldn't get through to you yesterday, and I was so scared, Tan. The doctor said I would become moody and emotionally unstable because of my pregnancy. I was just so scared." Tanner took a deep breath and asked, "Do you know my father had surgery for a brain hemorrhage?" Sandy's face turned pale. "I spent the whole day yesterday in the hospital with my father. Besides, didn't I already stay by your side for one night the day before yesterday? What else do you want? Do you want me to stay by your side when my father dies?" "I'm sorry, Tan. It's all my fault," Sandy said nervously. "I didn't know that." He covered his face with his hand and said in a heavy voice, "I'm tired, Sandy." When a man said he was tired, it could mean two scenarios. One was physically tired, while the other was mentally tired. Apparently, he was giving her a hint about something. Sandy pretended that she couldn't read between the lines. Tears began to roll down her cheeks as she said, "I really didn't know. Please forgive me, Tan. You should have told me. If you don't tell me anything, I'll just keep imagining things." She hugged him and continued, "I'm afraid you'll leave me. You and the kid are all I have. I promise you, I won't do anything stupid to make you unhappy again." Tanner held her in his arms. When he saw the blood that was seeping out of her wound, he said, "You should stay put since your wound isn't healed yet. You're not angry with me anymore?" Her shoulders were trembling. Tanner did not reply. After tucking her into the bed, he asked the nurse to tend to her wound. Sandy lay on the bed and kept her eyes fixed on him. "Tan, you are not angry anymore, right?" she asked again, insisting on receiving an answer. He watched as the nurse helped her get the gauze changed and nodded absent-mindedly. Maisie and Nolan returned to Bassburg after spending a few days in Karelia. They got down from the airplane and headed to a restaurant to fill their stomachs. As she flipped through the magazines, she saw a lot of news about the marriage between the Santiagos and the Hannigan. Are they really going to cancel their wedding? Nolan placed a bowl of soup in front of her and answered, "I guess so." Maisie pressed her lips thin and put the magazine aside. She picked up the spoon and began eating the soup. After a short while, she parted her lips and asked, "If I had been the one who encountered those things, would you have been disgusted with me?" Nolan lifted his head to look at her. "There aren't so many ifs." Maisie put her hand on her forehead and pressed on. "Just assume it happened to me." He chuckled. "Is the answer that important? I want you to think from the perspective of a man." Maisie stared at him. "Don't try to fool me. I want an honest answer from the bottom of your heart." Nolan put the spoon on the side and took a sip of water. "For most men, it is unacceptable." Maisie nodded. He put the glass down and continued calmly. "There is no absolute answer to anything. Who can guarantee that they won't fall in love with a woman? If a man doesn't love a woman, he won't even spare her a single gaze, no matter how clean she is. If a man loves a woman, he'll still love her no matter how bad she is. It doesn't matter if the person was once incomplete. What matters is that the heart should be complete in the future." Maisie chuckled. "Well, I can't argue with that. If I had sex with Willow that time, would you still fall in love with me, Z?" Nolan crossed his fingers together and rested his chin on them. There was a smile in his eyes as he looked at Maisie. She was stumped and replied in a low voice, "This and that are different." The smile on his face deepened. "How different?" "Both of you guys are women, aren't you?" Maisie glared at him and said anxiously, "Wouldn't you feel disgusted if I had slept with your enemy before?" Chapter 1208. As soon as Maisie finished speaking, she saw everyone was looking at them with an incredulous gaze. She had the urge to find a hole and bury herself in it for a moment. Nolan giggled and looked at her meaningfully. "So does this mean that you don't mind if it were other women and not Willow?" Maisie used her spoon to stir the soup and said exasperatingly, "It's okay if you want to try it now." "Okay," Nolan replied plainly. "I'll try it after I finish the meal." Maisie felt that Nolan was trying to make her angry, so she did not say anything anymore after that. When they returned to the Blue Bay Villa, Maisie got out of the car and slammed the door shut when the car came to a stop in the courtyard. As soon as Nolan got off the other side of the car and dusted his jacket, she crossed her arms in front of her chest and said, "I thought you're going to taste something new, so why are you getting out of the car, Mr. Goldman?" He smiled at her and replied, "Nah, I think it's better for me to stay at home and accompany my wife." Maisie turned around and headed into the villa. While she was changing her shoes in the doorway, Nolan hugged her from behind and whispered into her ear, his hot breathing ticking her skin, "Are you angry with me now, Z?" Maisie could feel goosebumps breaking out on her skin. She pushed him away lightly and said, "Of course not. How is there any possibility that I would be mad at you, Mr. Goldman?" "I'm sure you are," he said as he kissed her ear. Maisie grabbed his wrist and pushed him backward, pinning him on the wall. Nolan chuckled and freed himself from her easily. He grabbed her in his arms and said, "Are you going to hit your husband, Z? Let's have a fight." Maisie wrapped her arms around him. Nolan scooped her up from the floor and said, "Let's go back to the room and fight." By the time Tanner returned to the apartment, he saw Pearl was packing her stuff. She glanced at Tanner and continued to fold her clothes slowly. "I don't need other things, so I'm leaving them to you." She would only take away those things that she had brought. She didn't want things that did not belong to her, even if they were gifts from Tanner. Leaning against the door, Tanner said after a long while, "I'm sorry." Pearl closed the suitcase and rose to her feet. "I'm afraid I'm not the one you should be apologizing to." She pulled the suitcase and went closer to Tanner. "Can you move over?" However, Tanner did not move away. He looked at her and said, "I'll give you an explanation." "Are you pitying me?" There was no emotion in Pearl's eyes. They were so calm as if they were lakes, without a ripple. Tanner fell silent. Pearl then added, "What's done is done. She's having your baby, so the one who you should be responsible for is her, and not me." She reached out for the door handle, opened the door, and exited the room. Just when she arrived in the living room, Tanner came out and grabbed her wrist. "Let's talk." Pearl did not reply. Tanner turned her over and said, "It'll only take 10 minutes. Pearl seemed to be looking at him, but also seemed to be looking elsewhere. "Shoot," she said. Tanner took a deep breath and said, "I'm sorry about the wedding. I shouldn't put you and both our families in a difficult position." He grabbed her shoulders and tightened his grip. "It's my fault for letting Sandy get pregnant. She's emotionally unstable, so I couldn't leave her alone at the wedding." Pearl's eyes were glazed over. Her gaze appeared to be unable to focus any longer, and the man in front of her became blurred. She seemed to be listening, but Tanner couldn't be sure. No matter what Tanner said, she was indifferent. After Tanner finished talking, she lifted her head and asked, "Are you done? In any case, I'll compensate you." He paused for a moment. "Honestly, you don't have to move away. You can consider this house a gift from me." Pearl pushed his hand away. "But I don't want it." Tanner shouted upon hearing that. "Pearl, what else do you want me to do?" Pearl pressed her lips and smiled. She looked at him and said, "You don't have to do anything. Our marriage is done. You don't have to put on a disguise like you did before. Starting from now on, you can be yourself." Chapter 1209. Tanner was stunned. "I know very well how much you loathe and hate me. You're being nice to me because you had to. It's like a task for you to make both our families happy. It isn't that I have to be grateful to every man that wants to marry me. I know how bad my reputation is. Even if no one wants to marry me, I won't shamelessly stick to you, so you can rest assured. After all, I was once loved by all the Santiagos in the past. Even if a storm has ravaged a delicate rose, you can't deny that it was once a beautiful flower. You reap what you sow. It's my own mistake for getting myself into my current situation, and I don't plan to forget about it." When she finished speaking, she pushed Tanner away. Pulling her suitcase, she headed out without turning her head back once. Tanner stood frozen stiff on the spot as he tightened his fists. When Pearl got in the car, she turned her head and looked outside through the window. It was not that she was incapable of feeling sad or disappointed, it was just that she had learned to numb her emotions after suffering something even more painful than this one. She also felt she did not deserve to shed a single tear. Several days later, the Santiagos announced the wedding cancellation between Pearl and Tanner. Antonio just gave a few vague answers when asked by the reporters and left the press conference. When Sandy saw the news on the television, a smile hopped onto the corner of her lips. This was what she wanted to see: the annulment of Tanner's marriage with Pearl. She already has a bad reputation, so what makes her think she can win against me in this match, huh? Serves her right. It doesn't matter if I don't have a good background. As long as I give birth to the baby, the Hannigan will accept me sooner or later. That weekend, at the Topazes, Naomi stood in front of the full-body mirror to try on one set of clothes after another while Lucy was urging her by sending messages through the phone. She chose a thick orange sweater and a plaid skirt in the end. She put on a knit cap and went downstairs with her bag. Anthony was talking to someone on the phone in front of the window with a cup of coffee in his hand. When he turned his head around, he saw his daughter was heading out. He put his phone down and asked, "Nellie, I thought you were off today." "Yeah." Naomi was putting on her shoes in the doorway. "My colleague asked me out." Anthony was stunned for a moment when he heard what she said. After a short while, a smile of relief appeared on his face as he said, "I see. Then, have fun." Naomi smiled and nodded. The wind was cold, and the sky was gray. There was a layer of dark cloud looming over the city, and it seemed like it was going to rain at any moment. Lucy was pacing around in front of the entrance of the financial street. People were walking in a hurry around her. She looked at her phone and waited for a few minutes before seeing a figure rushing toward her. "Over here." Lucy waved her arm. Naomi stopped in front of her, her chest heaving up and down heavily. She took a deep breath and said, "I'm sorry for being late." Lucy chuckled. "It's okay. I can understand." She studied her up and down and continued. "You even have put on makeup and a skirt." Naomi was stunned and averted her gaze. "No, I dress like this every day, don't I?" Lucy lifted her eyebrows and said, "No. You look particularly beautiful today." Naomi rarely wore a skirt to work, and she would not wear a skirt in winter. Although she was usually rather reserved on normal days, she became even more gentle than usual when wearing a skirt. Lucy turned her head around. "Mr. Boucher hasn't arrived yet. He isn't going to stand us up, is he?" Chapter 1210. Lucy lowered her head to look at her phone. She had sent him a message before coming here. Naomi waited with her for a while and said, "Why don't we go for a walk first? We'll meet up with him when he arrives." Lucy thought for a while and said, "All right then." She then sent a message to Francisco. Both of them went to the shopping mall before heading to a restaurant. Lucy was starving, and she began complaining after taking her seat, "He really has stood us up. He should have told us instead if he doesn't want to come. He shouldn't have said yes to us and not show up later." As she flipped through the menu, she continued angrily. "All good-looking guys are liars." Naomi chuckled. "It's okay. I think we can have a lot of fun as well if it's only us two." "You're right. There are so many good-looking guys in the world. If this one is unreliable, we can always look for another one," Lucy said. It seemed to Naomi that she was not angry anymore, and she gave her a sheepish grin. Lucy lowered her head and pressed something on her phone. "I put him on my block list." "Huh?" Naomi was dumbfounded. Lucy put her phone down and said seriously, "We mustn't date a man who can't even keep his words. Maybe he's holding one in his arms right now, and he thinks it's fun to fool us. Sigh, this is all my fault. I'm a woman who likes good-looking guys. Whenever I see a good-looking guy, my brain will go blank, so it's normal for me to get cheated." Naomi frowned slightly. "I think Mr. Boucher didn't mean it. Maybe he's caught up by something? It has been 30 minutes. He hasn't replied to any of my messages, and you say he didn't mean it?" Lucy took a sip from the coffee and added, "Forget about it. I've already put him on my block list." Naomi lowered her head to look at the food on her plate. Nobody knew what was on her mind. Suddenly, the screen of her phone lit up. It was an unknown number. Naomi answered the call and put her phone near her ear. The voice that wafted from the other side of the line was familiar. "Your friend has blocked my number. I can't get through to her, so how am I supposed to know where you are?" Naomi was stunned for a few seconds, and she lowered her head to look at her phone. She then put her phone back to her ear and said, we're at the little spring now. All right. Naomi couldn't come around to her senses even after hanging up. Lucy waved her hand in front of her and asked, who is it? Are you still meeting another friend? No, Naomi looked at her in astonishment. It's Mr. Boucher. Lucy's hand froze, and she jerked her head up. You two have each other's numbers? And I still want to pair them up? So, they've been contacting each other. No, Naomi did not know what she should say. I don't know how he got my number. Oh my, Lucy yelled, would he be angry at me for blocking his number? Could it be that she was impatient, and he actually didn't plan to stand them up? Soon, Francisco appeared in the hall. He was wearing a casual business outfit. He put on a dark brown double-breasted trench coat with a belt around his waist and a black turtleneck sweater. Lucy covered her face with the menu. Fearing that Francisco would be mad at her, she hastily explained, Mr. Boucher, I didn't mean to block your number. I thought you stood us up, so. If she did not act so rashly, then things wouldn't be so awkward. I'm sorry. I've been driving and didn't pay attention to my phone. He pulled a chair and sat down. As an apology, let me buy this meal. But. This is so embarrassing, Lucy said. She was the one who had asked Francisco out, so how could she let him pay for the meal? He laughed and said, it's okay. Consider this my compensation for being late. Naomi lowered her head to take a sip of water. At that moment, Lucy looked at them and said, both of you are wearing matching colors today.